I'm Kara Infante, and this is Bookish Flights. In each episode, I chat with one bookish guest as we take some time to sample and savor the pairing recommendations from their bookish flight. We hope to give you suggestions to cultivate your TBR list and nurture your leisure time through books. In today's episode, I am chatting with Chanel Cleeton. Chanel is the New York Times and USA Today best-selling author of Reese Witherspoon's Book Club pick Next Year in Havana, When We Left Cuba, The Last Train to Key West, The Most Beautiful Girl in Cuba, Our Last Days in Barcelona, and her upcoming The Cuban Heiress. Originally from Florida, Chanel grew up on stories of her family's exodus from Cuba following the events of the Cuban Revolution. Her passion for politics and history continued during her years spent studying in England, where she earned a bachelor's degree in international relations from Richmond, the American International University in London, and a master's degree in global politics from the London School of Economics and Political Science. Chanel also received her Juris Doctor from the University of South Carolina School of Law. Welcome to the show, Chanel.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm thrilled to be here today.
Thank you. Well, that's quite the impressive resume. I have a question for you to start out. Did you always know you were going to be a writer amongst your studies there?
I didn't. I'll be honest, it was kind of something that snuck up on me. I have always been a lifelong reader, so I that my passion for books is kind of one of those things that's followed me all through my life. And when I was in law school, I was really just wasn't a great fit for me. I enjoyed it, but I didn't have the same passion for it that I'd had for some of my other studies. And so I was thinking about what I enjoyed doing and what I kind of wanted to do as a career. And I thought, why don't I try to see if I could write a book, since I've always loved reading. And it was just one of those things, once I started doing it, it sort of hooks you. And I fell in love with the process and kept writing and working on my craft. And that's how I got into the job. But it was definitely something that I wouldn't have thought of for myself. I'm much more of kind of a business oriented person. I'm not particularly creative. This is like my one creative thing. But I think that's what I love about it is it's a creative outlet for me. It's a really wonderful process for me to be able to sit down and work on a book. And so it's been kind of the perfect fit for my personality. I get to do the business side of it and the business side of publishing, and then also getting to have this wonderful creative outlet.
That's wonderful. And I imagine I'm not a lawyer myself, but having been to law school, it makes you a really good researcher for your novels.
That is something that I don't think I fully appreciated until kind of later in my career when I really thought about it, because you read so much and you have to learn how to kind of condense the material that you're reading and to kind of read analytically in a very effective manner. And so I think that has been super helpful for me. And also the writing, you write a lot in law school. And in my undergrad and my master's, I wrote a lot as well. So that definitely kind of helps lay the foundation, even though obviously different genres, but it was a good practice for me, even just with typing. I think it's been super helpful with how quick I can be when I'm drafting my books.
Yeah, that's what I found so impressive as I've done the show a little bit longer and I've talked to various authors is the amount that you guys research that go into your books. And for me, I know that's just not my type of personality where I could research and I could have notebooks upon stuff. Like for me, once it's out in the world, I don't really go back and, like you're saying, analyze. So I'm like, I don't know that I would be very good at that, is going back and analyzing everything that you've accumulated in your research to then condense it into a novel, which is very impressive.
Oh, thank you. For me, that's one of the fun parts of the job, definitely. I mean, you kind of go down all these fascinating historical rabbit holes and you learn new things. And it's really interesting to see, especially with historical fiction, how much the history shapes, the plot of your books and the characters' lives. I think that's part of the challenge of it. It's like putting a puzzle together and seeing kind of how all the pieces fit.
Yeah. And for us as readers, I know we love that part too, right? That's what I'm doing as I'm reading, as I'm trying to figure out where all these pieces fit in. So, but kudos to you guys for doing all the hard work and condensing it into a beautiful story that we can read. I've read a lot of your books. My husband is actually, his family is from Cuba as well. So that was what first kind of turned me on to the Next Year in Havana was where I started. Because I've heard stories throughout our relationship from his family. Both his mom and his dad's side of the family are from there. And so for you in your researching, did you start with some of the stories you've heard from your family along the line?
Sure, that's a great question. So it's sort of evolved throughout my career. Next Year in Havana, like you mentioned, was my first historical fiction book. I had written romance before that. And with Next Year in Havana, I was really inspired by sort of my relationship with my grandmother. Next Year in Havana, if you haven't read it, is a dual timeline book. And so part of it's set in revolutionary Cuba, kind of right before the revolution breaks out, and then in its immediate aftermath. And then there's also a contemporary storyline. And so I really wanted to kind of explore my Cuban American identity in a way that I hadn't done in my books before. And also kind of honor, the stories that I'd heard and the legacy that had been passed down to me from my family. My family left Cuba after the revolution and they came to the US in 67 as refugees. And so much of my upbringing was really, hearing those stories and seeing the impacts that the Cuban Revolution had on my family's life. And so while, the Perez family was very much a fictional family, and I didn't want to tell necessarily my family story, in part just because, that is so personal, and also the fact that I think real life does not always translate as well when you're writing fiction. And so I wanted kind of that freedom to have this family and to see where their lives were going to take them. But it was definitely an opportunity to put, little family stories, certainly my emotional connection in the book and that sort of thing, and to honor that legacy. And then really, from there, the Perez family, it has kind of these larger than life characters. And so they really took over and sort of shaped the direction of my next books.
Yeah.
Beatrice is the heroine. She's one of the sisters, for the readers that haven't read the earlier books. She's one of the sisters in Next Year in Havana. And her story really just kind of captured me. And then I wrote When We Left Cuba. And so it took me on a journey that wasn't necessarily one that I had predicted when I started writing Next Year in Havana,
Yeah.
but enabled me to kind of learn about parts of Cuban history and Cuban American history that I was less familiar with. So much of my family's stories and the influence that I grew up with was shaped around this, transformative event, which was the revolution in 59. But being able to go back and kind of, with the most beautiful girl in Cuba, look at the Spanish American War and the conflict, the fight for independence in Cuba from Spain, it really enabled me to get kind of a broader understanding of Cuban history and sort of see where all of it kind of fit in together. So it's been an incredible journey that I feel like these characters have taken me on. And then with the Cuban Heiress, this is sort of the first time that it's really a standalone book. We don't have Perez
Okay.
characters in this book, but it's been so interesting to learn about the SS Morro Castle and to, once again, an event that I was previously unfamiliar with, to be able to delve into it and learn this new history.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, again, back to why, as readers, I love historical fiction, as I'm learning at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
So, and I think, from my husband's family's perspective, right, of I've heard these stories from his family, but then putting these actual events into the timeline really help shape how I view it too. And I love the books. They're just fantastic. Listeners, if you have not read them yet, I highly suggest that you pick them up. They're so fun. And like you said, the larger than life characters, you really get into the story through the characters, and I love them. So,
Oh, thank you.
is your family enjoy reading them as well?
It's been definitely interesting to hear, people comment that they've read them and family friends and stuff. It's definitely special to kind of have that connection.
I recently read The Mountains Sing. Have you read that?
I haven't, no.
Okay, it's about Vietnam, but it's
Okay.
actually when, communism was kind of coming to power and what this family went through. And it's told in a dual timeline from a grandmother and the granddaughter's perspective. But the reason I'm bringing it up is because it really made me think about the side of the story from the family side, where the granddaughter wasn't old enough to understand what was happening. So the grandmother's like, well, I'll tell you later. Like, you're not going to learn this in your history books at school. And just how almost they were deleting out part of their history, right? And I'd never thought about, from the stories I've heard from them, that was not a side I had thought about until I read that in this book of Vietnam with, similar situation with communism coming into power in their country, quote
Hmm.
unquote. So it was a very moving book for sure. And I was like, wow, I bet this was similar for them too. And just how it ravaged the families who had to flee.
Hmm. I will definitely, that sounds really good. I will definitely have to add that to my reading list. So thank you.
Yeah, it's definitely emotional and it's a tough book. I mean, she covers some tough
Mhm.
topics in there, but I think it's stories that need to be told. Just like I love these books, right, of learning about the history of Cuba. These are the legacies that have been left behind for us to learn from.
Mhm.
Well, great. Can you tell us a little bit about what your writing process looks like? How long does it take you? How long are you researching?
So each book is a little bit different. With Next Year in Havana, which was my first historical fiction, because I think I did have such a personal connection to the book and I had grown up so much with the stories. That one was really one that the book came to me very quickly. And so I was able to write and then sort of research and fill in as I went. Another book like The Most Beautiful Girl in Cuba, where I was less familiar with the Cuban fight for independence from Spain. I did a lot of front loaded research for that book before I even started writing. And so it really just depends on the subject matter. With the story of the Moro Castle and the Cuban heiress, I knew that I wanted to take this real life event. So the SS Moro Castle is a real ship. It was in 1935. It went on a round trip journey from New York to Havana, and there was a fire and basically a great tragedy at sea. And so I knew I wanted
Wow.
to use that real life story and that framework in the book, but I very much wanted to have fictional characters and to be able to kind of envision what their lives would have been like with the ship. So it was really a marriage between research and also letting my characters and the plot guide me. And each book I feel like speaks to me a little bit differently in terms of what it needs and what my process needs to look like. In terms of kind of universal things, I always write in Scrivener. That's a program that I really enjoy.
Okay.
It's a great tool for writers because you can put a lot of your research in files there. The way that this kind of file is done, you can move scenes around very easily.
Oh,
With working
cool.
with dual timelines or working with multiple characters, I often find that I'm kind of playing with where do I want to flip the chapter? When do I want to break a scene? When do we need to hear this character's voice or when do we need to change time periods? And so having that kind of functionality is really great. So that's sort of something I always do. And then I always edit in Microsoft Word and go back and forth with my editor. I find that the editorial process is really where my books shine.
Okay.
Obviously, with kind of those initial drafts, it can be messy, and you sort of give yourself, I think, the creative freedom to just sort of explore. Oftentimes I'm what you call a pantser. So I don't really plot a lot before I start writing. I really find that the research and the characters sort of guide the plot of my story. And so sometimes, that means I'm moving things around or changing things up or still sort of getting to know my characters. And then once I have all of that down, when I go through the edits is where I really feel like I can kind of refine and build out where I want to and get the book kind of into the shape that I want it to be. So each book's a little bit different, in terms of how long it takes. Often, honestly, what drives it the most is that I publish a book a year. So typically, I am
Okay.
drafting one book at the same time that I'm editing another, and then I'm promoting a third. So
Wow.
often it's like, you'll be drafting a book and you have to kind of set it aside because you get edits in from your editor and you need to pivot to that. Or then, like right now, while I'm promoting the Cuban Heiress, I'm not really drafting or editing too much because my focus is on that. So it's a little bit of just sort of shuffling things around and figuring out, what needs to be the priority at that moment.
Yeah, which I imagine helps too, right? It kind of gives you a break for in each scene, or not scene, but you know what I mean, in each part of the process, whether you're promoting or drafting or editing, right? You're kind of getting a break, I imagine, in the way you're using your brain, right? You're using it in a different capacity in each one.
Yes, no, that is very true. I will say the biggest challenge, honestly, is that sometimes you have so many characters in your head or so many settings and time
Yeah.
periods that, when you're talking about the book, you're like, okay, wait, this is, the time period. So that part can get a little bit, but I think, probably the law school multitasking comes in there where it's helpful to be able to just sort of home in on one thing. But yes, it's definitely an interesting part of the process and getting to kind of flex different creative muscles at different moments.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you for sharing about that. I also would call myself not a creative person. I've said this on the show before, but I'm a physical therapist by trade.
Oh, okay.
And I had always said, really, I mean, I didn't do art. I didn't really write very much as a kid, but I played the piano. So I always had considered that my art as a kid. But starting this podcast now about 6 months ago, but doing this has really been a nice creative outlet for me. And so I think I'm like,
Mhm.
I'm kind of working on that skill a little bit now and flexing my non-physical therapy brain in a different way.
Definitely. No, it's fun, I think, to be able to do those things and have those outlets.
Yeah. So have you been able to travel to Cuba?
So I have not been to Cuba.
Okay.
Coming from an exile family, that is definitely something that is sort of a hot topic. So shall
Yeah.
we say, when I was drafting Next Year in Havana, we were actually planning a family reunion. My grandmother comes from quite a large family. And so there were about 60 of us. It was back in 2016 when travel had opened up again. And so there were about, this large group of us that were thinking about going. But my grandfather became very upset about the idea, and it kind of opened a discussion in our family about whether or not it was appropriate to go, how he felt about it. I have family members that have gone, family friends that have gone, and I completely understand. Everyone has their own perspective on it and their own personal connection to why they want to go or don't. But in our case, I think just because it was such a strong feeling for him, we decided that we weren't going to go while things were the way they are. So that's one of those things. It's always been kind of the top of my bucket list, and I think that through Next Year in Havana and writing that book, I really got to kind of have that emotional, sense of being able to feel like I'd had an opportunity that maybe I wasn't able to yet have given the current situation in Cuba. So that is definitely, I think I return to Cuba so much in my books because it is something, I grew up almost with it being kind of a family member. My
Yeah.
grandparents lived with us, and so they talked about it on a daily basis, and it was such a huge part of my life. We ate Cuban food. I spoke Spanish at home. All of that was so important. That having kind of that distance between the islands, and my identity has been kind of a weird dichotomy, in those two. And I think that's something when I talk to other Cuban Americans that I think has really resonated about, especially Next Year in Havana, with readers who have kind of been in similar situations and understand that feeling of, exile and how that affects subsequent generations.
Yeah. Yeah, I know my husband, they had talked like I guess the boys of the family, let's say, about taking their grandfather back, and they had some issues looking into the visa. And my husband's also in the military, so I don't think he can actually go right now.
Mm-hmm.
But right when you were saying, like when the embargo opened, they were like, "Oh, maybe we'll go," and they started looking into a trip, and um, it didn't pan out. And his grandfather kind of ended up being like, I don't know that I'd want to see it the way it is today. Like that's not the Cuba I remember, you
I
know?
think, yeah, I think there's a lot of, conflicted feelings, and the vast majority of my family came to the US and so, or overseas to Spain. So it's not like we have family there. I know a lot of people go back to visit, and I do have kind of extended family that some of my family has gone back to visit. But we don't have necessarily that same connection that I know many people do.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's for them very similar situation too. Most everyone's here. So I'm laughing when you say large family because when we were planning our wedding, I remember being like, okay, let's get our guest list together. And his family alone was like 100 people. And I'm like, okay.
Oh.
I'm like, where are we going to fit all these people? But we'll figure it out.
Uh, yeah, I'm an only child of an only child, so my immediate family is very small. But my extended family, lots of cousins, and my grandmother had quite a few siblings, and so yes, I have kind of a large extended family.
Yeah, that's how I like my mom on my side of the family. I'm literally even the only grandchild. So I have such a small family over there. So for me, like marrying into this like 100-person family, it was at first it was okay, wow, it's really loud,
Oh,
but beautiful and and so fun. Well, what was the funnest book you've written?
oh, that's a great question. I will be honest, and I'm really not just saying this because it's the book I'm talking about, but The Cuban Heiress was probably my most fun, just because it was a bit of a departure for me. This book has a lot more suspense than my other books do, and
Okay.
I'm a really big suspense reader, and so for years I've been like injecting more and more suspense into my books, and so for this one to kind of have that freedom was really fun. And then also, I felt like there was really good energy between my characters. So one of my heroines is Catherine, and
Okay.
she's on the ship. And you learn very quickly, I'll be honest, this book is very twisty, and so I have to always be careful when I talk about it to not give away spoilers, but you
Well,
learn
thank
pretty
you.
early. Yes, no, I always try to be careful. You learn pretty early on that Catherine has a lot of secrets, and that she has this interesting past, and she sort of clashes when she's on the ship with Harry, who is a thief who's on the ship. He's a dual thief, and so they have this like really fun banter, and their interactions are some of my favorites. They have kind of an ongoing sort of bit between them that I really loved writing. And I put it in, and I was like, okay, when you send the book off to your editor, you never know like what they're going to want you to take out or what they like. And I was like, oh, please, I hope she doesn't make me take out this little banter that they
Yeah.
have between them, because it's like my favorite thing. And then when I got her edits back, and she was like, I love this, I was like, thank you, because I was going to fight for, not having their banter go away. So it was a lot of fun to write. It's a very tragic story and what happened with the ship, but it's also seeped in so much kind of real life mystery and drama, and that's what really drew me to the subject. There's a lot of interesting characters that were on the ship. You have smuggling going to and from Cuba at the time because of the political
Wow.
situation. It's the Great Depression, Prohibition has just ended. It was basically like this party ship where people, lived these very extravagant lives on this cruise. And so it really opened me up creatively to imagine what kind of people would be on the ship, and to really delve into these very fascinating lives that I feel like my characters got to have.
Yes. Oh, that sounds great. And it comes out, is it April 13th?
April 11th.
April 11th. Oh,
Yes,
today.
yes, today. Yes,
Congratulations. Oh my
yes.
goodness. Well, listeners, you won't hear this. May 10th is when your
Okay.
episode's coming out, but that's so exciting.
Thank
Congratulations for you.
you.
I'm like,
Thank
I didn't
you.
have that written down. So off the top of my
No,
head,
and
I
I
was like,
wasn't sure when I was going to air, so I wasn't going to say, oh, today. But yes,
oh,
today is release
that's
day.
so exciting. What does that feel like when you're like, ah, it's out in the world?
It's a little nerve wracking. I will be honest. I stopped. I haven't counted, how many books I've released. But probably this is like maybe my 15th or 16th. But it still doesn't get any less nerve wracking each time. You
Yeah.
still kind of have. I hope readers like it. I hope that they enjoy the characters and the story, and yeah, there's definitely that element. But it's always fun. Writing is really a solitary endeavor in so many ways. I mean, I have this amazing team that I work with, but so much of it is kind of me, at my desk, sharing it with like my
Yeah.
agent, my editor. Not too many people get to read the books before they're out in the world. So it's really cool to get to have these dialogues, to do these events and podcasts, and to feel like I really get to connect with readers. I mean, that's the special part. I mentioned earlier, I came to writing as a reader. So talking about books is one of my absolute favorite things. And so being able to have, these moments is really what I love about the job.
Oh, yay. Well, congratulations to you.
Thank
I
you.
think this is the perfect segue then to dive out to who you are as a reader. And I know you've mentioned you've always been a reader, but what type of books do you like to enjoy reading?
So I really pretty much read everything. And I
Okay.
think that's reflected probably in my writing. I started off, I've written in quite a few different genres. And it's always just if I like to read it, I have an interest in writing it. And that's sort of how I came to historical fiction. I loved reading historical fiction. So yeah, I think pretty much everything, there's something you can appreciate, I think, about every genre. And as a writer, I feel like I learned so much. Romance, for example, does dialogue so beautifully, and I feel like they do
Yeah.
character development so well. And so when I read a romance, I feel like I really connect with the characters, and I get to see this like sparkling fabulous dialogue, when the hero banters and that sort of thing. So I love reading romances, suspense, for this page turning element of it. I think they really do a great job of kind of teaching you, where to break scenes and how to kind of leave your readers on that cliffhanger. So
Yeah.
there's something in every genre that I feel like I learn from, and also that I really enjoy as a reader.
Yeah, I actually meant to add that when you were talking about how you've been adding more suspense in your books. And the most recent book of yours I read was The Last Train to Key West, and that book for me was like that, where I was okay, I gotta know what's gonna happen. So I guess I better figure out. I was listening to it as an audiobook. I'm like, I guess I better go find some other task around the house to keep working on to know what's gonna happen. But I felt the suspense in that one because I want to know, how this all fits together and do they make it out? And So yeah, I loved that book for that reason because it kept me going, and I read it so fast. Well, listened to it so fast because I had to know the ending.
Well, and I will say that, I kind of do like read alikes. Like if you like, and for me, I would say that The Last Train to Key West and The Cuban Heiress are probably my two most similar books because they're both set in the 1930s, actually are both set over Labor Day weekend. And they both are set over kind of relatively short time periods where you have this large external event that influences the characters' lives. And my research process was really similar for both books
Okay.
because both books had investigations into what happened. And so there was a lot of primary source documents talking about the aftermath, kind of debriefing, these two events. So those two are very similar, I will say.
Yeah, I'll go buy it when we get off the show
Oh,
here.
thank you.
But yeah, I mean, even that hurricane in Key West, I never knew anything about that. So I learned a ton, and I'm sure from the Cuban Heiress I will as well. So thank you.
Thank you.
Um, so, and I know you've been so gracious to prepare us a book flight today. And so, why don't you start by telling us a little bit about the theme
Okay.
of the book flight?
So I mentioned before I wrote romance before I started writing historical fiction. I always love historical fiction with a love story component. Most of my books have, kind of a strong love story within them. So I did some of my favorite historical fiction love stories.
Okay, great. Well, what's the first book of the pairing today?
So the first book is The Bronze Horseman by Paulina Simons, and it is this really, really beautiful story. It's set in World War II Russia, and it's this gorgeous love story. It actually the love story spans three books. The Bronze Horseman's the first one in the
Okay.
trilogy, but you really get immersed in life in Russia during this period, and the characters are just really, it's kind of a coming of age story. It's a family saga. It has so many components to it. So I really recommend that one. I read it years ago, and it's probably one of the books that sparked my initial passion for historical fiction.
Oh, that sounds like great. Family saga, coming of age, and some romance in there. I love it. I've never heard of this book, so I'm really excited
Oh, it's
to.
amazing. I hope you enjoy it. It's a big book. Like
Okay.
it's long, but it's one of those books that it's very hard to put down, kind of what we were just talking about.
Yeah.
So you just sort of feel very immersed in the story and the characters' lives.
Oh, that's great. And that's another area of the world that I don't know much about, so I would love to learn about as well.
It was for me as well. So it was another when we talk about the part of historical fiction where you learn something new. I was also not as familiar with that history and that moment in history. So I enjoyed that as well.
Yeah, I have been part of the premise of why I started the show is I wanted to, I know we all kind of fall into our ruts, let's say, of books that we, genres that we like, and we tend to stay there and we always pick those up. And I'm like, well, I want to see. I always said I never thought I'd never liked fantasy. So I was like, well, I'd love to. I knew I had a friend that liked fantasy. That was her go-to genre. And I'm like, what if I just start recording, talking to people about trying different, themes of books or genres? And so she's gotten me to read this fantasy genre based off her episode. And those are some thick books, but they've been page turners. So now I'm a little more open to picking up the bigger book because I'm like, well, like it can be a page turner too. So it doesn't seem like I'm reading a 580-page novel.
Mm-hmm.
So that's great. Okay. Is there anything else you'd like to add about that one?
I think those are kind of the highlights. It's a great one. I definitely recommend, especially if you love a good love story. It's kind of unforgettable.
All right. So that was The Bronze Horseman by Paulina Simons. And then what's the second book of our pairing today?
So the second book is The Map of Love by Adaf Suif, and it is a dual timeline book. It's set in Egypt at the beginning of the 20th century, and then it has a contemporary timeline, which at the time it was published was the end of the 20th century. I read
Okay.
this book in college. I was actually I studied for a summer in Paris, and I was there, and I picked it up in a bookshop, and just absolutely fell in love. It's one of those books I've reread so many times over my lifetime. It's this really gorgeous love story. It's a young woman's kind of connection to her grandparents' love story. And so it shifts between the two time periods and also is this really fascinating look at Egyptian history and Egyptian nationalism. So I highly recommend it. I mean, the prose is stunning. It was a Booker Prize finalist. And it's just really one of those incredible books that will stay with you for a lifetime, basically.
Yeah. Has the book followed you home from Paris, or do
Oh,
you have a new
yes.
copy now?
Well, no, so I do still I have it in the ebook and I also have the same copy. And I kind of love the fact that it is, the copy that because I always have that memory of, just picking it up. When I studied for international relations and global politics, I was kind of specialized in the Middle East. And so I had a huge interest. So I remember picking it up at the bookstore, and because it had the Egyptian setting, being really interested in it, but had no idea, how much I was going to fall in love with the story and the characters and the writing. And I've read her other books, which are phenomenal. So it's definitely a book I recommend. And I always have kind of special memories of that one.
Yeah, I did a semester in Rome, and actually speaking back to Russia, I thought, well, I'll bring Anna Karenina because I had never read it, and it was a thicker book, and I was like, I'll bring it. It should last me this semester, right? Because I knew I would have classes, so I was going to be studying along the way as well.
Mm-hmm.
And I didn't know if I would be able to buy English language books in Rome, so I was
Mm-hmm.
like, well, I'll bring this, and I remember like struggling through that book for the entire semester. And my roommate kept being like, are you still reading that? Are you still reading that?
Oh.
I'm like, yes. Well, and that was the stage of my life when if I started a book, I always had to finish it. I've
Mm-hmm.
since given that up. I don't have to do that anymore. But I was like, yes, I'm going to finish. I have to know what's going to happen. But that was my first exposure to Russian literature. And it was a task to tackle for sure.
No, and back, when I was in Paris and when I lived in London, I mean, when we would travel, finding English language bookstores was a little bit harder back then. Like I didn't have, that was kind of pre-ebook and everything. So yeah, I remember I brought some books over with me and that sort of thing. So yeah, I definitely I can relate to that.
Yeah, what a great experience, though, to be able to do that. So I tell all my younger cousins now, I'm like, if you have the opportunity, go study abroad. It'll
Yes.
change your life.
No, absolutely. I think it's definitely one of the most formative things for me for sure.
All right. Well, that was, I'm sorry, I digressed there a little bit. The Map of Love by Adolphe Suisse. And then what's the last book of the pairing today?
So the last book is Along the Infinite Sea by Beatrice Williams, and that is a dual timeline set in 1960s Palm Beach, and then it's kind of pre-World War II, and then a little bit the beginning of World War II. But it's this really beautiful love story once again, and I love Beatrice Williams also writes really great family sagas where you can kind of follow her characters throughout different moments in the family's history. And that was a book that I just remember, the love story like completely hooked me, and I really felt like I was there with her characters. I think she so beautifully brings her settings to life, and her characters have this great kind of electric chemistry. And so I really loved that one as well. And it has a gorgeous cover. I have to say that's something too. All three books have gorgeous covers.
Oh, I'm gonna have to go look them up here. I haven't heard of any of these, so this was very exciting for
Oh,
me.
I
I'm like,
love
oh,
that. I'm so
yeah.
happy that I recommended to you. They're really like for me, if you did your kind of desert island historical fiction, that would be, on my list for sure, all three. So
Yeah. Well, and you'll have some beautiful covers to look at while you're stranded.
yes, yes.
Okay, well, that was Along the Infinite Sea by Beatrice Williams. So thank you so much for that. How I usually end our show is what I call our bonus pairings, which are just a speed round of questions. You can just answer these really quick. But first one, are you a rereader?
Yes, absolutely.
Love it. What about, do you prefer audio or hard copy books?
I prefer hard copy.
Awesome. And then what is one book that you have read that has changed your life?
One book, and I will recommend this for you too if you haven't read it, is Waiting for Snow in Havana by Carlos Ayer. It's a really
Yeah, it's on
incredible
my
memoir.
shelf,
Okay, no,
actually. Yep.
it's so beautiful. It was one of the first books that I felt like really kind of brought my family's experience to life for me when I read it, many years ago, and it's incredible.
Okay. Yeah, I think I bought it a few years ago at a used bookstore for my husband. And he goes in and out of reading and he hasn't picked up, but it's still on our shelves. I can picture the cover right now.
I'm looking at it on mine as well. So
Yeah.
yeah.
All right. And then lastly, what are you reading next?
I am just starting an arc of The Measure of Silence by Elizabeth Langston, and she's a friend from kind of the beginning of my reading career. We have the same agent, our writing career, and she has a new book coming out that's historical fiction set in the 1960s. It kind of centers around the Kennedy assassination, and it also
Oh, yeah.
has a dual timeline component. So I'm starting that one, which I'm very excited for.
Oh, that sounds very intriguing. Well, I thank you so much for your time today. I know it's precious and I appreciate all that you've given me this morning.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. This was wonderful. I really appreciate it.
You're so welcome. Thank you so much for listening to Chanel Cleeton and I in our discussion today on her book flight of historical fiction love stories. I hope you've enjoyed it. We'd love to hear what other books you might pair with this book flight at bookishflights.com. That is also where you can find more information on today's flight and any other books that we talked about today. I want to inspire a community of readers. So whenever you share a post about what you are reading or what you are picking up next, especially if you have heard about the book on the show, please tag us. Follow us on Facebook or Instagram at Bookish Flights. This is a brand new show, so if you enjoyed it, please head over to Apple Podcasts and give the show a review. Your review not only helps me, but it also helps the show reach others. Make sure you are subscribed on Apple Podcasts or Spotify to make sure that you will not miss an episode. That's it for this episode. Thank you so much for listening. As Emma Thompson said, I think books are like people in the sense that they'll turn up in your life when you most need them. Cheers to you, dear readers. Until next time.